have no disclosures, but I have a couple of confessions that I'll get to in a minute. Mark Twain wrote that the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between the lightning and the lightning bug. I have some very specific things I want to say today about the lightning. So my first confession is that in order to say exactly what I mean, I will read this, even though Rich advises the residents against doing that. Second, my research advisor when I was a resident, George Ogeman, taught me both about the nature of language and how to operate on the approximately 200 patients I treated surgically for epilepsy, the most gratifying part of my career. The best papers I ever published, I wrote either with him or about these topics. I owe him a lot. In those same years, though, he often lamented that as researchers age, they abandon science and tend to philosophize. So I must also confess, George, there's going to be some philosophy here. My first day in a hospital was on a Sunday morning in the summer of 1948. I was 5, and my thoracic surgeon father took me with him to the county hospital. While he made rounds, he parked me in a narrow, tiny nurses' station occupied only by women dressed in starched white uniforms and wearing those weird little hats. For the next 30 minutes, they fussed over me, brought me orange juice and donuts, and I thought to myself, why would anybody do anything but this? I was a doctor from that moment. I'm about to read to you what I have learned over the intervening 72 years, but not right away. Naturally, it all starts with football. My qualifications for employing this metaphor are the 12 years I played, which Dr. McDonald informs me might explain a lot. That's me. I was very good at looking good, I think. The Baltimore Colts dominated pro football for 10 years in the mid-1950s to 60s. They are remembered mainly for the offensive stars, quarterback Johnny Unitas, running back Lenny Moore, receiver Ray Berry, and the fullback Alan the Horse Amici, who once ran into the goal pole, then sat just inside the goal line and told the coach that after he scored, someone hit him really hard in the end zone. But the anchor on the defensive side, and maybe the guts of that team, was number 70, all-pro tackle and Hall of Famer Artie Donovan. Not long before he died, Donovan said this: "I'm a nobody, just like you or anybody else. I was lucky enough to play football, and everybody liked me. That's it." There are many other ways to imagine one's place in the world, although I think Art Donovan's summary of his spot on the line is especially terse and discerning. A more complex view is how John Locke saw the possibilities for our brief moment as a collection of molecules in the universe, hopeful, self-determined, and positive. On the other hand, the humanitarian Thomas Hobbes envisioned life from the other side of Oz's curtain as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It wasn't for him, though. He lived pretty comfortably to be almost 92. Still, Tom was not optimistic about human beings. A century later, Immanuel Kant imagined that innate features of our minds inform our experiences. These features today might be seen, certainly in this Zoom, as the barrels of our neuronal connections. Kant believed that all minds structure experience similarly, meaning that all humans share an understanding of certain essential features of the world, more or less automatically, a priori, he said. Though I'm a little wary of taking on Kant, when people claim that things are automatic or instinctual or natural, there's very often a void in the understanding somewhere. As one example of that failure, Kant believed that our ideas about cause and effect, as well as space and time, are fundamental to all of human experience. Cracks have opened in this thinking. For one thing, professor of linguistics Dan Everett has proven that the Pitahan, tribe isolated in the Brazilian rainforest, have absolutely no concept of time whatever and no language for past or future events. For them, all of life is the same day. An important consequence of Kant's thinking is that our experiences of things relate to the phenomenal world, that which we receive with our senses. Like Plato, he thought that we do not have direct access to things themselves, only their shadows through the lenses of a limited spectrum, through a glass and darkly, like Kelly and Jeff's rubber hand experiment. After almost 250 years, we remain preoccupied with these same questions. In Critique of Pure Reason, however, Kant nudged German philosophy slightly away from knowledge as interpretation of sense perception and toward the intrinsic problems of what are really neural mechanisms, and ultimately, like the members of the Vienna Circle 100 years later, to language uncertainty. He defined a vocabulary outlining his method, which explained that an object produces a sensation, in turn creating the empirical intuition of a category of objects he called phenomena, these corresponding to the sensations of material things. When objects exist or might exist beyond what can be imagined by the human mind, those metaphysics reside outside of interpretation and beyond speculation. Philosophy should, he demanded, address the questions, what may I know, for what may I hope, how should I be, and what is man? While Kant and his contemporaries hoped to find absolute solutions by this method, the postmodern view admits to all of those relative conditions that many find so unsettling. There's a position I favor held by existentialists suggesting that all of what we so fervently believe we know is true derives from those tautologies we manufacture from our own experience and forge into reality with the semiotics we ourselves have invented. We believe a thing to be enduring and absolute because we thought it, and then we're able to express it to others in symbols, sounds, letters, or numbers. These various options define a fundamental argument about human nature, imagined hopefully by Locke on the one hand as free will, and by Kant on the other as mostly determined. The ineffable argument of nature-nurture put into strict philosophical form. In fact, I think both of them were correct. Until very recently, philosophers, like the rest of us, didn't really understand the code. We come into life with the template of our DNA, which does absolutely define us physically and in some measures behaviorally. What happens to us in the first 6 or 7 years of life determines the rest of how we inhabit what philosophers of the mind now refer to as the cognitive unconscious. But at the same time, we do have some kind of decision-making capacity, or at least most of us do. Those who do not, we define as abnormal, the mentally ill, the differently abled, the emotionally disturbed, or certain current political figures. Beyond what we believe to be the case, I have found that as a practical matter, one gets back in life simply that which one projects. Wisdom isn't really acquired by most normal people. One must be a little mad to find that. Jesus, Aristotle, Mozart, Gandhi, Wittgenstein, Einstein, Heisenberg. Perhaps that most melodious of postmodern philosophers, Waylon Jennings, said it best. It's not that I'm wiser, it's just that I've spent more time with my back to the wall. I got a couple more years on you, baby. That's all. If we cannot gain wisdom, most of us with a couple more years can at least find something obtainable for the average person, an understanding of the larger self. This breeds empathy and maybe a kind of what we call immortality, if by that we mean being remembered well by a few people for a little while, which is really all that most of us get. It's difficult to find happiness in oneself, thought Schopenhauer, but it's impossible to find it anywhere else. There are philosophers who contend that life is the interval between two nothings. Epicurus was one such when he says, I was not, I have been, I will not be. I do not mind. In less speculative terms, we die twice, once when we stop breathing, and again when the last person speaks our name. The scale is different for some, but so what? Near the end of Tractatus, Wittgenstein wondered, is a problem solved because I live forever? To find happiness, people must pay attention to how they live, try to be unselfish, love others even when they are unlovable, and be dedicated to their work. For Viktor Frankl, who knew suffering in the camps of World War II, the meaning of life is to find meaning. All of us from time to time feel as though the great demand placed in our path is suffering. But I put it to you that suffering is great demand placed upon one with no possibility of reward. I doubt anyone here has felt subjected to that. I found meaning when I was a resident here at Harborview, perhaps because there is so little ambiguity about what is happening in this place. I discovered 40 years later that exactly the same substance remains. When Rich invited me to rejoin the faculty 12 years ago, I knew the work itself would be enjoyable, but I wondered how on earth I would handle the always more difficult task of personnel management. After all, I'd been away from academics and more or less successfully managing myself since leaving UW for the first time in 1980. So I thought I'd have trouble relating to the young medical students, residents, nurses, and staff, and all of the prominent faculty members, most of whom I then didn't really know very well. And the two I did know, George Ogerman and John Lozier, had been my teachers. I figured all of that would cause me trouble. I've been wrong about many things, but never more wrong than that. The past dozen years here have been among the most rewarding and enjoyable of my now long life. I had a happy and enormously satisfying surgical career at Group Health. We all did. We were probably the last generation of big city neurosurgeons who were able to do everything. And here I mean able in the cultural sense of being permitted. For many years, we operated on children, spines, tumors, peripheral nerves, infections everywhere, AVMs, aneurysms, and of course, subdurals and shunts. We did all of those things. We did all of those things reasonably successfully and helped the great majority of our patients. The modern subspecialists are much better at it because after all, you get good at what you do. When I began the work I've been doing here now for several years, the job was not really defined. The ACGME pedagogical expectations pushed up against the clinical training requirements and patient needs, as well as the operative demands. I wondered about how to help solve those competing necessities, to make a place for myself, and perhaps most of all, to be useful while not appearing antediluvian to the residents and students. It turns out the faculty welcomed us, the job matured, and I came to befriend and deeply admire each of my colleagues. Eventually, they found that I perhaps was sometimes useful. At the same time, I can say that in a surprisingly avuncular way, I have loved all the residents, the NCCU and TICU nurses, the practitioners, the students, and I certainly have been occasionally useful to them. Love is not too strong a word, because I have received more from my commerce with the young here than I have contributed. Love is not the opposite of hate, but the repudiation of that disquiet. Love is an experience separate from all others. It is the emotion that creates an understanding and gratitude for the root of this singularity we abbreviate in the word life. What the early Christians called agape, pure love, but a feeling that does not necessitate a deity. Wonder and gratitude are enough. The great writer Denise Levertov has these lines in her poem, Primary Wonder. There is anything, anything at all, let alone cosmos, joy, memory, everything, rather than void. We are given an enormous gift as a community of neurosurgical residents, teachers, staff, and practitioners. We should be optimistic, grateful, and joyful. Happiness is not in another place, but in this place, said Walt Whitman, not for another hour, but for this hour. If any of you doubt that even for an instant, read Hans Christian Andersen's horrifying metaphorical parable, The Fir Tree. I do acknowledge all of what I have just said might be a little hard to see when you're in R2 up all night for weeks at Harborview. A few years ago, a former resident asked me if I was still working because I needed the money. No, I've never really done anything for the money. If money is the goal, there are lots of easier ways to find it than in neurosurgery. Ask Ben Carson. If your goal is to be rich, it's easy. Be selfish. If you want to be happy, be generous. That's what Tolstoy's great story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, is about. A thing that Ivan discovered so sadly and too late. More conversationally, as the jazz drummer Art Blakey mused, you can't just go around thinking about making money. Don't no armored car follow you to the cemetery. The only thing that follows you to the cemetery is respect, and you have to earn it. Art understood human nature as well as most psychiatrists. I think it can now be acknowledged that by modern standards, Freud was a quotidian psychiatrist. I mean, nosebleeds mimic menses, really? But he was nonetheless a genius in that he saw the child as parent to the adult. And when he wrote Civilization and Its Discontents, I think one of the greatest works of nonfiction ever published. There, Freud said, there are two things that define our common humanity: the requirement of work, which was created of external necessity, and the power of love. Over the now more than 50 years of my career, I have had the joy of both enormously gratifying work and a love of the other almost every day. When I came back to the faculty, I'd already learned the routine pleasures and the occasional painful sorrows of being able to do the work of a neurosurgeon, to love the patients, or at least to try to love them all. And I remembered as a resident that in some ineffable way I would not have been able to articulate then. I especially loved the Harborview rotations. I think most residents do. When I returned, I didn't realize that I'd also loved the entirety of the hospital, especially the staffs of 3 West, 6MB, all of the several IVUs in the clinic. And when I say staff here, I mean the wonderful bedside nurses who will do anything to save a sick person. The managers, practitioners, nursing assistants, the social workers, the discharge planners, the techs, the dietitians, the custodians, the cashiers in the cafeteria, the whole joint. I never expected to love the medical students who have become such a great pleasure to me, and I certainly did not suppose that I would so love the residents. Every one of them, even those ambitious and swaggering grandees who were sometimes difficult. I tell you most sincerely that I have loved you all. And if any of you have learned anything from me, it isn't because of what I have said or done specifically, but because of how you have perceived me, just as I learned from George and John. Of course, one has to start with a certain amount of ambition to become a neurosurgeon in the first place. But here's the thing. Eventually, we have to mitigate the excess desire, and sometimes we must acknowledge its occasionally attendant juvenile aggression and competitiveness in order to find our so very fortunate contentment hiding in plain sight. To expand on these ideas, here follow 2 philosophical movie reviews, a genre I believe I have invented. Andrew Coe might have to correct me. In Woody Allen's fine film Match Point, the boyfriend character tells the Scarlett Johansson character she's beautiful. No, she replies, my sister is beautiful. Sexy is what I am, thereby partitioning love and lust. I mention this not to admire Scarlett, who certainly needs no help from me, but because the residents and the medical students in their creative youngness sometimes read books and essays I've written or listen to what I have to say on rounds or in lectures and mistakenly think I'm wise and smart. No, my wife is smart. Lucky is what I am. If you've seen the film, you know that Scarlett's boyfriend was too. William James, for my money, one of the greatest of American thinkers, said, all of life is chance and habit. Much of what becomes of us, I think, is luck. That and the residual 6-year-old tucked away inside of us, which is, in the end, also mostly luck. Just try to calculate the odds, for example, of a union between the seed and egg that made you instead of all those others wasted, much less the specific strands of your parents' DNA winding around each other. However much we may hope to be created equal and however deeply we believe that hard work and diligence are the entirety of what has caused our rise to the place we inhabit, I think chance is much of what defines us. In William Blake's Auguries of Innocence, he writes, every morn and every night, every night and every morn, some to misery are born. And every morn and every night, some are born to sweet delight. Some are born to sweet delight. Some are born to endless night. We all know this to be true simply by walking out through the ED and looking north across Jefferson Street at the inhabitants living in the bus stop on that corner. For many years, I concerned myself with the large errors of the world, especially nukes, when I was president of Physicians for Social Responsibility. I have come to believe these are simply transient points of view driven into policy, and they have recurred in various forms since the DNA got sexy. We are the code that has been modified by chance since the base pairs learned how to write it. When I seek to understand my compulsions, for example, I need look no further than my dog. I'm occupied with less formidable problems now, things I might have more opportunity to influence, the students, the residents, even the younger faculty maybe, patients still, anyone who might accidentally read things I've written. There I think what I've gathered over the past years might matter a little. As William Blake also wrote, we never know what is enough until we know what is more than enough. Put more colloquially, in his very strange and wonderful novel, Virgil Russell, the writer Percival Everett said, wisdom comes not to us through time, but through vigorous sexual excess. Not that I pretend to wisdom. By my great hero Wittgenstein, I have no metaphysics. When I die, all that might remain is an idea in someone's memory. That's enough for me. No grand ambition, no need to set it all right, no requirement for a named chair, no immortal soul. With apologies to the believers, I think the churches have it backwards. We're already in heaven, at least those of us like us here today, who are so very, very lucky. In the Coen brothers film, A Serious Man, the object of concern is truth, not intelligence, luck, or beauty. Here we meet a community of people for whom everything goes wrong. This in itself would be tolerable for them because they're all Jewish and they're accustomed to things not working out perfectly. What makes their situations absolutely intolerable is that none of them can figure out why it goes wrong, and they each are obsessed with finding that answer. Off to one side, the main character, a physics professor and a sort of narrator in the Greek sense, teaches Heisenberg. He understands uncertainty and is the vehicle for bringing that idea to the audience. But even he, and perhaps he more than anyone, hungers for the answer. The physics professor's junior high school dope-smoking, foul-mouthed, sex-obsessed, music-loving son, in other words, an adolescent male, is busted in class one day for listening to his tape player through earbuds rather than paying attention. He later has to go visit the terrifying senior rabbi about this deportment. The boy walks into a long, dark, Byzantine office. Seated at a gigantic desk, the antique rabbi looks at him and for a long time gathers himself for what the audience expects will be a great Talmudic truth. And then he says, "What if everything you thought was true turned out to be a lie? What then?" Which is a holy line stolen from the theologians Grace Slick and the Jefferson Airplane. He reaches into his desk and pulls out the confiscated tape player. "Be a good boy," he tells the kid. "The best truth we can hope for is to try to be good boys and girls, for in our cognitive unconscious lurks the 6-year-old, always telling us what to do." Schopenhauer thought evil is that which is positive, that which makes itself palpable, and good, on the other hand, all happiness and gratification, is that which is negative, the mere abolition of a desire and extinction of a pain. Therefore, one may say, as cold is the absence of heat, so good is the absence of bad, as love is the absence of hate. More evocatively, as the wonderful Northwest writer Ray Carver has it in a poem written when he was terminally ill, titled "Late Fragment." "And did you get what you wanted from this life even so? I did. And what did you want? To call myself beloved, to feel myself beloved on the earth." Finally, here are the last paragraphs of the fine short story Time Gentleman by the wonderfully named Hortense Kalischer. Is that a great moniker or what? This is the story of a little girl, a privileged little girl of 7 or 8, living very well in Manhattan in 1900. The century may be new, but still the previous one lingers. Her mother, young and modern, wishes for her always to hurry, to move quickly in the manner of the new age. Her much older father, a gentleman of the past century, advises that she progress slowly, to idle really, to take her time in a more liquid humor. Even as a girl, she recognizes that there are precedents and arguments favoring both of these positions. The story ends this way, with her recalling that childhood 50 years later. "And I know where I am now. If there are any gods in this place, I must pray to them, as once one could to the comfortable old evils of Ra and Baal. I must pray to dollars or boom, for this place is the middle of next week." And then from over the rim of the world, I hear voices, the dividing voices. "Run, run," says my mother. "Can't you run a little faster?" And then I hear my father's voice, Radamanthine, serene. "You have time," says my father, "all the time in the world." And from the pinpoint where I stand, I can see it, the old place, lit up bravely as a fishbowl against the dark shadows of eternity, moving slowly while it persuades itself that it stands still, the whole improbable shebang falling through the clear ether silently with all the house lights on. I myself now stand on the same pinpoint of probability with Hortense, and from that overlook, I am ever grateful to each of you and all of your predecessors for the talents you have shared with me in caring for the sick, especially those Mike Kopus used to demand we refer to as the unfortunates, and all the joys you have brought to my life. I return now very briefly to Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, a book of fewer than 100 pages, but one so densely obscure and demanding that it took me 10 years and an enormous amount of study to read it and understand. Wittgenstein begins with the simple proposition: the world is everything that is the case. And then proposition by proposition, he most modestly attempts to correlate everything that can be known. In the last few pages, the tone of the work changes completely and the entire construct fails because he realizes that even he can't do it. The book ends with what I consider to be one of the most perfect sentences ever written. Whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must keep silent. I'll end by thanking my Harborview colleagues, most especially the self-proclaimed best damned intern in the house. While I think the current R1s might push him a little for that title now, it was my friend Rich Ellenbogen who first recognized that it might be useful to recycle a used brain surgeon like me, and who, simply put, is a magnificent chairman and an even better person. We're all really lucky. Thanks to my friend Louis Kim for his enormous talents in so many areas, all that he does for HMC, and the help he gave me when I needed it, and because he didn't accept a chair somewhere else while I was still working. Thanks to my cousin Mike Levitt for reminding me that everything I think I know, I learned back before fire. And he's right, of course, as he is about nearly everything, except for the couple of times he mistakenly ignored an old man. Thanks to my friend, the great Lollagom Shaker, who went out of his way to befriend me in 2008 when he really didn't have to. Thanks to my friend Rajiv Saigal, who's bound for greatness in the spine world, and pretty soon too, although maybe not because of Riluzole. And thanks to my friend Fengyi Zhang, already a spine great on 2 continents, who never, ever turned me down. Thanks to my friend Mike Williams for helping us fix any shunt, no matter how complex. Thanks to my friend, the singular and occasionally quixotic Randy Chestnut, for his dedication to the science of TBI, his algorithms for the care of those patients, and the enormous fun I had rounding with him and the residents at 6 a.m. on Mondays, when I always learned a very great deal, often about woodworking and rugby. Thanks to all those past and present on the practitioner team, especially Jenny and Natalie, who work so hard and take such wonderful care of the sick and injured. Last, thanks to Catlin Goss's son. Catlin was a talented general surgeon at Group Health with whom I sometimes operated. I first met Rick when he was a very tired undergraduate almost 40 years ago. As Associate Dean and Medical Director, he now works tirelessly, fairly and honestly, not only on my behalf when that was necessary, but for all of us and for the mission, just as Mike Kopis expected. And now I must keep silent.